This video is sponsored by Ren, but more on that later in the video. Hi everyone, it's me again, and Squish Gang is present as always, and today we're going to be talking about the recent situation with David Dobrik and Jeff Wittek. And as you saw, today's video is sponsored by Ren, which is really exciting, and I'm really appreciative of being able to work with a company that promotes such cool causes. We'll get into that a little bit later, but first, just the regular housekeeping. To take this opportunity to like, comment, and subscribe. And there's an Amazon wishlist down below if you wish to support the channel or simply peruse some books that I recommend regarding rhetoric and things like that. Also, the books that I'm going to be using today, including landmark essays of contemporary rhetoric, will be linked down below as well. I want to say that I owe my life to my comment section because you guys suggested this video once again, and I'm really excited for the topic, and I thought it was a really cool idea. So if you want to make yourself seen, the person who commented this, my last video, comment down below and I'll pin the comment or make you seen if you so desire. So for trigger warnings for this video, we have kind of trauma, SA, mental health and depression, threats to safety, and serious injuries, because it's regarding, of course, Jeff Wittek. Now, to call 2021 a rough year for David Dobrik is one of the biggest understatements you could probably possibly say. However, it is rightfully so to some extent, given that a lot of this was backlash due to David Dobrik's irresponsibility with his platform that has been occurring for many years. Of course, we have to kind of go into the moral dilemma of Jeff and David Dobrik. They are both kind of, somewhat problematic characters in this case, so we kind of need to make sure that we kind of take this as far as we can regarding kind of being a little bit more careful with the situation, because of course there's going to be moral dilemmas, but we also need to acknowledge that David Dobrik has wronged Jeff Wittek and been irresponsible with his platform, which has resulted in this accident in the first place. Because if David Dobrik wasn't the type of person to utilize his friends who he doesn't pay to do more dangerous acts with him in exchange for clout, then we wouldn't have gotten here in the first place. This is another one of those situations where two or more things can be right at the same time, right? That Jeff can have been wronged in this whole situation, and that David Dobrik can be the one doing the wrong, but that also Jeff Wittek has a problematic past and has done some kind of questionable actions with his friend, kind of visiting Ethan Klein's house and things of the like. So we have to kind of keep a balanced idea here. Now, parts of the video, we have part 1, David Dobrik's cancellation in 2021. Jeff's defense of David post-accident before this current time. Then we have part 2, Jeff's change of heart, and David Dobrik's views podcast. And part 3, why I think David got away with everything for so long. This is where the rhetoric element comes into the video. Before we get into the start of the video, I am pleased to announce that this video is sponsored by Ren. I am pleased to be partnered with such a positive company that works to combat climate change through climate action. Now with Ren, you do a simple questionnaire, you can see me doing it here, where you figure out what your carbon footprint is. And once you do that, you are redirected to causes that help combat climate change. You can then potentially do monthly contributions for, which you will get emails regularly telling you updates on those changes. Now I know personally, living in Canada, with British Columbia last year reaching record high temperatures, that now is more important than ever to offset our carbon footprint. With the projects including tree planting, mineral weathering, and rainforest protection, that there are lots of options that you have to fund these types of projects, whichever one favors you the most. While we can't all have a zero carbon footprint, we can do anything we can to try to reduce the one we have now. And with projects such as the ones that Ren provides, it makes it easier than ever. I'm personally invested in the cause mineral weathering in Scotland. I'll put a little picture here of what it is. This is because I'll put some pictures as well of where I grew up. I grew up in a really forested area where there were lots of trees, and I would do a lot of cleanups with my school and at home as well. And this is the project where they're going to be sprinkling basalt in the forest in Scotland that would then speed up the carbon cycle. And the coolest part about it is that it would trap the carbon into rocks for that would last for millions of years, thus kind of offsetting the carbon in the area. Fast growing project. This is one of their new projects that they have. And as someone, like I said, who grew up in the forest area, the idea that there are innovative projects such as this that can help reduce the carbon in the forest is really near and dear to my heart. And while it will take a lot to reduce the carbon footprint of the society we live in, offset your carbon footprint with Ren. And the first 100 people to click the link in my description or the one of the pinned comment, they're the same link, will get an extra 10 trees planted in their name. I want to thank Ren once again for sponsoring the video, and let's get right into the situation. So part 1, David Dobrik's cancellation in 2021. So a lot of things began to stir. From my knowledge, it was kind of started from the Frenemies podcast with Ethan Klein and Trisha Paytas. And around this time too, an article came out from Insider regarding a essay allegation from a person who went by Hannah from Dirty Dom, which was actually filmed and published in one of the vlogs. Of course, not the actual essay event necessarily, but kind of the events leading up and post that those interactions. No one had really spoken about this too much until this point, nor did people really kind of put two and two together when watching the vlog, obviously, because they're not going to be admitting to these things in vlogs or anything like that. Once David Dobrik began to get called out, Trisha Paytas had mentioned that Jeff had gotten in an accident in one of the Frenemies episodes, and Jeff Wittek and David Dobrik had actually made an effort to kind of keep this, out of the public eye. And then once this kind of began getting stirred and people were noticing, well, where's Jeff? People began questioning not only David Dobrik, but the vlog squad as an entity. And the fact that people from the vlog squad or anything weren't really talking about Dirty Dom's allegations or any of these types of actions that had occurred, and people were really shocked. And actually, Scott had made a video kind of trying to defend David Dobrik and talk very poorly of Trisha Paytas and Ethan Klein, and how Trisha Paytas was not a creditor to be conversing with for any of these things. However, while I agree with that, Trisha Paytas ended up being pretty accurate about a lot of David Dobrik's tendencies and what happened and who, participated in what. Frenemies actually had an interview with Jeff Wittek where you got the infamous "Okay, Ethan" clip that they play on the podcast a lot, or the soundbite, if you will.
I'm trying to learn here in this situation. My guilt is only by association in that bit, just by going over there.
Again, I think you're, from what I can tell, a good dude. I don't think I understand that you feel bad, and I believe that you didn't have anything to do with the events as they unfolded. I think the intent of the author was to first of all talk about Dom, first of all talk about David, how he enabled it, and the culture of the entire vlog squad, which unfortunately you are a member of, how it all acts to enable this kind of thing, which I don't know if you've been following, but there's more and more videos of girls saying similar stuff happened to them like this through the vlog squad. Now, nobody's directly saying you did anything,
everybody
okay?
under this
But I'm just
squad,
saying that
umbrella
this
is now going down. But for me, morally, I feel like I'm completely innocent, and now this whole thing is crashing down. And I understand it's because my name was put in this by this reporter, so that's why maybe.
Now, I think this was a bad interview to have on everybody's part. Because one, I think that Jeff Wittek was in no place mentally, psychologically, or even with just pure physicality, his head was in. Two, I don't think he was in enough of a place to be able to come up in his own defense, especially because it was essentially 2 against 1 with somebody who had been in such a serious accident. And the fact that David should have been able to come to his own defense regardless. It shouldn't have been Jeff who had to come forward with it, because they're not condemning Jeff for getting into the accident, but rather David for putting Jeff in that position. Regardless of this interview and how disastrous it was, Jeff remained on David's side for a very long time, even making jokes and kind of celebrating the downfall of Frenemies when it occurred in the summertime. However, Jeff gradually faded out of the Vlog Squad videos, as did many of the ex-members of the Vlog Squad. They kind of just gradually faded, and with not much being heard from them afterwards, such as this happened with Big Nick as well, and Gabby Hanna. And Ethan Klein and Trisha Paytas also brought up other scandals of, they also talked about other allegations, such as when Jason Nash kissed Seth in a mask. Seth also left the Fox Squad, for those of you who wouldn't know, but most of you would probably know if you're watching this video. So that kind of, all those things kind of coming together came to a crux, and Ethan Klein and Trisha Paytas kind of facilitated this cancellation of David Dobrik. And this was as Jeff was kind of trying to come back into the public eye after the accident had occurred. And it was very weird to people when they're trying to figure out why Jeff would have defended David up until this point. And it's kind of bizarre, because this gets into we'll get into the rhetoric of it afterwards, but this kind of idea of inhibiting, bringing forward consequences to people and trying to avoid it for the sake of business interaction is in very poor taste for David to have attempted to do, especially given the fact that it was his life that was in his hands. Jeff's life was in David's hands, and he took advantage of it for the sake of YouTube content, 4-minute and 20-second vlogs, to be exact. Because David Dobrik in the Views podcast even described it as this big comeback video that they were going to have.
You've never talked about the accident. You want to go through it?
Yeah. I mean, we were filming a video, my comeback video I haven't posted in a while, and we wanted to do something exciting. And there was this YouTuber that we were collaborating with for it that did these really cool, really cool visuals of people doing the coolest things. And one of them was people wakeboarding. I don't know what that's called, while holding on to an excavator.
So part 2 is Jeff's change of heart and the Views podcast with David Dobrik and Jason Nash, where they discuss this whole thing. Jeff recently began to speak out against David Dobrik, kind of on Patreon live streams and in Instagram posts and things like that. This came as a surprise to many, given kind of Jeff's state of being very defensive of David for quite a long time, and how he had consistently supported David even through like the quote-unquote hardest times regarding like the Dirty Doms allegations and the stuff with Seth. Many are wondering, why didn't Jeff choose to file a lawsuit against David Dobrik before this, like as soon as it happened, right? Obviously, Jeff is well within statute of limitations to do so anyways at this point, because it's only been about year and a half, not quite 2 years, if I remember correctly. In those Patreon live streams, Jeff mentioned that David Dobrik was supposed to be paying Jeff's medical bills. That was kind of the agreement that they had come upon after this happened. David was pretty negligent and wasn't getting the payments in on time. Now, apparently in the United States, I've heard some hospitals or medical institutions, if you get into an accident, you can't pay your medical bills, it gets put into collections, and then when they're put into collections, that ruins your credit. Now, I mentioned before, I live in Canada, so I don't really know how that works. And I even remember watching the H3 podcast and they were talking about it when I was researching for this video, and they were debating on like what medical bills can go to collections. So I don't really know how that works, but I'm going to take the benefit of the doubt and say that's what happened with it. And it was so weird to me that like the medical bills in general were in David's name, and it seems like he was kind of just sending money to Jeff to pay them, or just like doing it through Natalie, while it should have just been entirely in David's name, and he should have been automatically given the amount of money so that things like this wouldn't happen, because again, it was for his content and his actions that caused this accident in the first place, so he should be taking full responsibility rather than this like 60-40 nonsense that he tries to talk about in his podcast later. So in Jeff's live stream, he also mentions that he's no longer affiliated with David Dobrik, calls David Dobrik a crook, and cited him as the reason of that Jeff was not part of the Bryce Hall roast because David couldn't handle the jokes that Jeff had made about him, and even brings up in his response podcast later that there's actually a picture of David Dobrik with a laptop, seemingly writing notes on the podcast on the roast about what should be taken out and what should be left in, while David Dobrik denied that he had any say into anything in the Views podcast, which was interesting.
I mean,
one, Jason said that he never even saw the roast. David was there with his laptop fucking taking notes. He oversees every edit. He oversees everybody's thing. Jason has to go through him to get approval of what jokes are left in. I think one time there was like an Alex Warren joke or something, but that he made him cut from the last roast because he didn't want to mention it because he copies his style of videos at the time or whatever. Enough with the bull.
So we watched David Dobrik's Views podcast with Jason Nash and his assistant Natalie. It starts out where David just says he wants things to be dumb happy, that he wants to bring forward like positive vibes in his videos, and there's no negativity here, happiness all the time, which is obviously a facade, especially given the fact that he had been dancing on the edge of these types of accents for a really long time with the dangerous content that he was doing in his vlogs. And he felt like because he wanted to be positive all the time that he didn't have the ability to be authentic. And on the podcast, he says, I'm going to take this time to be authentic. For the next few weeks, we're going to be authentic. Despite the fact that he shows very little human emotion really in this podcast, is very deadpanned and kind of seems like he's almost like forcing emotion at some point, which is interesting because he made a comment earlier in the episode that Jeff wanted David to show some emotion regarding his accident when he was filming his documentary, and David said he was unable to do so. So then he says that the last 2 years have been the worst year of his life, and then doesn't follow that up with, but they were definitely worse for Jeff, or that they were definitely the worst years of Jeff's life, which was absurd to see. Tries to save face by saying like, I invited Jeff here and he didn't want to talk to me, but like I totally respect that, and we respect Jeff here, but it's weird because he's not here, we can't talk to him directly. And it's just so interesting to me that David Dobrik frames Jeff's accident as the worst day of his life. Like not his being Jeff's, his being David, which arguably you could say of course it would be, and I agree to that notion, but it's always framed in David's perception of his life. And at one point he even says like, I understand why Jeff will kind of loathe us, because I'm like running around having the time of my life going on these trips while Jeff has to do a bunch of surgeries. It's like, you are so tone deaf, bro. Like, oh my god, you literally said he's mad at me for having the time of my life while saying the accident was the worst day of your life. And what's interesting is David Dobrik describes this video with the excavator that was like supposed to be his comeback vlog because he hadn't uploaded in a few months. And it's interesting that for David's comeback vlog, he said we want to do something exciting. This is after he had sent Natalie and Jeff and somebody else whose name is escaping me to get skydive certified. But David wasn't going skydiving with them, and David wasn't getting swung around on the excavator either. Like, so David's comeback, right? This is like the whole thing with him. We'll talk about the rhetoric too, with the way of consequences and business interactions. So David's comeback had to be facilitated in the most exciting way possible by everybody else. So then David, with that notion, in my opinion, is essentially saying that he is nothing without the vlog squad. Like, he is nothing because he is not one doing any of these. It just brings up this kind of interesting dichotomy of David Dobrik not supporting those that make his entire career, and he doesn't even pay them, according to Jeff Wittek. I don't know. I can't confirm or deny that necessarily. This is alleged, but that's what Jeff was saying. So David attempts to take responsibility while constantly kind of planting seeds that it was Jeff's idea, planting seeds that, you know, it just kind of got out of hand. And he says that he can't take full responsibility because it was like also Jeff's idea.
Hard thing to like navigate when you're in the hospital with something like that, because you don't know whether or not to be like super serious and caring or goofy, right? Like, I don't know how to do that. And I remember Jeff told me to check my DMs, and it was a video that he found like 15 minutes before the accident that somebody posted, and he said, let's recreate this. And it was a guy swinging from an excavator and flying off. I didn't see that DM till the hospital, and he jokes. He's like, I didn't mean literally, haha, like he joked.
While perhaps it could have been Jeff's idea, it's your vlogs, your content that you profit off of, and actually not everybody else. They get exposure, which of course you can gain entire careers off of that exposure, but you still should be paying them regardless, allegedly. You are making this shift away from responsibility, stating essentially directly that you are nothing without other people. And then David Dobrik gets into the fact that Jeff wanted him to show emotion, how he thought that was kind of weird, which again, when David kind of seems like he's doing some kind of crocodile tear thing in the podcast, was just so bizarre to have that presented. I feel like if you're trying to do that, you can't also say I couldn't show emotion at the time that this was happening, because that means then you're showing that your emotion is related to how your life has gone as a result. If you couldn't show the empathy at the time that this happened. And he even says, I've never, when they're talking about medical bills, David says, I've never had a harder time communicating with anyone besides Jeff. This is when effort should be at the top priority. I don't think that's really an excuse. I don't think there really can be an excuse for something like this, because Jeff says that he was like a centimeter off from instant death. I have trouble communicating with him is not really a viable option out of here. So when we get into Jeff's response right away, so before Jeff,
I don't know. I hate saying that because it does sound like I'm like, it's not about me, it's about the people watching.
I know. I've known this guy long enough to see how he does things, and he's setting himself up. Look, this is me. I like happy stuff. I don't like sad stuff. So when my friend fucking nearly dies from my actions, I turn it off.
Like Jeff says, I've never watched this before, okay? Within 30 seconds, Jeff says, oh, David's starting to do his regular setup thing, where he says that all he's trying to do is spread positivity and have happy content. And so like Jeff's like literally predicting things as they come. Now maybe someone could say, well, he definitely watched it before, but I don't think he did. I think it's just so obvious that David has these types of interactions and does things in this way, which you could have seen from the cover-ups and various ways trying to get around things that was happening when Ethan Klein and Trisha Paytas were on him, with David essentially sending people out against them without addressing anything direct. So David describes that his main problem with Casey Neistat's documentary, they weren't able to like demonstrate quite as well as he wanted, that like David will beg people behind the cameras to do things for him in the vlogs, like, oh, can you do that stunt again? Can you drive a little faster this time? Can you hang out of the car just a little bit more? Things like that. Now, that is alleged, and obviously I've not seen Casey Neistat's documentary, but that's along the lines of what Jeff was going for. What's interesting, like in the facial expressions and the body language difference, if like I'm not that guy on YouTube who knows all of these things, I forget his name. People compare me to him a lot, which is interesting. But I don't know anything about body language as a science. If it is a science, if it's a pseudoscience, I'm not really sure. But all I'm saying is that you can see the facial expressions and the perceptions that they're each having. Jeff's are much more similar to aligning with genuine hurt than David Dobrik's are. David Dobrik is he looks like he's just trying to make a statement. Like his facial expression and all that kind of stuff is definitely giving like or early 2019 Logan Paul apology video, not so much, or early 2018 Logan Paul apology video. So we're looking at like the body language, right? David Dobrik's in the Views podcast is really giving early 2018 Logan Paul apology video vibes, right? Well, Jeff, if you can see in the little box, I'll put a picture, of course, that he looks very distraught and like legitimately hurt. That is the difference between like emotional interactions to absolve yourself of responsibility versus interactions that are involving like intense traumatic aspects of your own life that you feel like is being devalued. And then Jeff describes that his idea was not to have the excavator swinging at 60 miles per hour with someone on the rope, but rather to kind of have it like a lazy rope swing, which would mean like either the arm just kind of sedentary or it moves really, really slowly. And then you kind of just swing off and go into the water, which I feel like even if Jeff insisted on a 60 mile per hour spinning arm, that David should not have complied with that out of obvious reasons that that's extremely ridiculous and dangerous and doesn't make any sense. And then Jeff reiterates that David's career is built entirely off of other people, which I mentioned too as well earlier in the video. Jeff directly combats to the idea that David had said that it was hard to communicate with him when talking about things like medical bills and stuff like that, which I like agree with the sentiment as well, that David Dobrik being so flippant about everything made it so hard to deal with him that Jeff felt that he might as well do it by himself. Because that's the thing too, is that if someone who had almost ended my life was so negligent with my medical bills that I ended up in collections, then I wouldn't want to continue working with them in the fear of ruining my credit and the rest of my life further, especially if I can find a way to make the means for it. So it's not Jeff being stubborn. And even then, Jeff mentioned that there was like this like really revolutionary stem cell surgery that he wanted, and David said, I'll go halvesies on it. Not like the fact that Jeff wouldn't even have to entertain or think about the idea if he never met David in the first place. You know, and like I agree, maybe it's a prideful thing, maybe it's certain people that are maybe overly independent even. But I really agree with the idea of if someone is just being so dismissive that I wouldn't even want to bother with them anymore. So I don't think it's necessarily like a stupid idea that Jeff was done and didn't want to deal with the medical bills through David anymore. Jeff says that he's doing what he should have always done and is letting the courts decide. Which then again too, right? That if the courts decide and then David Dobrik gets sued for, you know, a few $100,000 or whatever it might be, that Jeff's medical bills are still paid at the end now, aren't they? So, you know, and like I think suing David is just kind of a good idea when it's irreversible damage, really. You know, it's part 3. We're going to get into really quick is we're talking about why I think David Dobrik got away with things for so long. So Rhetoric is not necessarily about being right or wrong. For those of you who watched my videos before, this is something that I have discussed in length. In the Landmark Essays of Contemporary Rhetoric, which is the book I have here, the introductory essay on political rhetoric discusses kind of that idea of that rhetoric does not necessarily show direct truth. However, it does what's called probable truth, the term that they use in this book, which relates to the idea of like the reality that you perceive through the persuasion of the other person. And this is of course useful because that's like the purpose of rhetoric, right? It's situations that might not be objective or have been manipulated into not seeming objective, which I would argue is this case, that there's the elements of persuasion that come in with rhetoric. So if you can demonstrate something consistently through a persona, you can then swing that persona into the realm of probable truth. And this comes into play when people are able to equate happy videos and good vibes with a positive, good vibe person. Even though in the podcast, David does mention that he doesn't feel genuine doing that. So if all you see is positive vibes and like that happy person, you don't necessarily have a reason to think otherwise. Because some may ask why David would have come back to address this after all this time. And I think it's because he has to kind of meet that supposed reality that he has spent so many years crafting, even though there are consequences with even addressing it, and it feels disingenuous. So the first quote I want to pull from this book that I think is really related is in the section called Concept of Rhetoric. This says the following: Perelman holds rhetoric to be a theory and practice of all argumentation which aims to secure the persuasion and conviction of audiences in political and other humane fields, and also in the sciences. Rhetoric is at work whether a writer or speaker seeks through argumentation to secure the assent of others to these as he advanced. Burke's theory commences not with an intention to argumentation, but to such nature of man as a symbol-using animal. Says Burke in 1962, rhetoric as such is not rooted in any past condition of human society. It is rooted in an essential function of language itself. The use of language as a symbolic means of introducing cooperation in being that by nature response to symbols. In this view, rhetoric seeks to promote cooperation using symbolic, linguistic, and other strategies of identification. That is enough to suggest in Western thought that rhetoric has been assigned various ends: social intercourse, personal relations, salesmanship. So that's what I think David has done with that kind of good, that's that whole good vibes perception that he was talking about, is that aspect of it has been brought to the service of politics, religion, science, literary achievement, social intercourse, personal relations, and salesmanship. I skipped a line by accident. So it's saying that the various ends that rhetoric can have, and that's what this whole channel is trying to demonstrate. And I've reiterated many times, is that idea that rhetoric fits in more than just, Aristotle and old philosophy, or, and things like discourse analysis, or, connotation, denotation, things like that. I'm trying to relay that there is very many possibilities that surround the field, and that is used in different ways. And YouTube is a salesmanship of the own persona. You're selling your content through your personality. And then we get into the idea of what are called, so we're talking about like rhetorical consequences in this case. So when we're talking about David addressing everything, John Dewey makes a really good argument with how people have to face consequences and how they do it in a business perspective, which David's content is his business. I just said you're selling your brand through yourself, right? So we take then our point of departure from the objective fact that human beings have consequences upon others, that some of these consequences are perceived, and that the perception leads to subsequent effort to control action so as to secure some consequences and avoid others. Following this clue, we are led to remark that the consequences are of two kinds: those which affect the persons directly engaged in a transaction, and those which affect others beyond those immediately concerned. In the distinction, we find the germ of distinction between the private and the public. When indirect consequences of an action are confirmed, or thought to be confirmed, mainly the person directly engaged in it, the transaction is a private one. So, essentially they're saying, like, once something gets into the crux of needing to be dealt with, a lot of people will try to pull it privately, which is why I don't believe in a lot of comments I got on my Gus Johnson video and my CNMA video, which was like, oh, how dare this be on social media? Even though the interactions that they make with their career are public ones. And the purpose of not addressing consequences is that these cycles are enabled and continued. In Dewey's view, then, consequences of some transactions are short-lived, non-recurring, and only of minor significance. They do not require attention and control. But other transactions produce consequences that are widespread and enduring, and to the extent they affect the persons other than oneself for good or evil. The transactions and their consequences amount to the public's business. So it's in rhetoric science that these things are going to come out. And it's in rhetorical theory that these things are essentially inevitable to come out, and that regardless of a private transaction, if these types of actions and cycles can go further than them, then they will be dealt with in the public regardless. So that's why the argument of like, this should have never been online, which Dave Portnoy was throwing around in the CNMA interview, or people have been throwing around in my Gus Johnson video comments, is not necessarily logical or doesn't function within the realistic ideologies of the human race. Because of this, David Dobrik has been having, a lot of issues, because in that kind of public upbringing of that argument, David has not had very many like human interactions with this. He has been very still and very calculated and he's been kind of suspicious with how he has been, and with that, people are suspicious of David as a character and do not trust him. And then they've noticed these kinds of cycles that have been brought up by people who have left the vlog squad, such as dependence on others for content, misusing people's trust, and just overall being someone who is very disingenuous. And I think Jeff having a far more human approach to this whole thing, despite the fact that he has not necessarily always been truthful, given the pain and the manner of the accident, especially the fact that it affects, the brain, I am inclined to believe that he is at least trying to be honest, and through like what I've been reading in here, and what I know about rhetoric and what I know about perceptions and ways to cover your ass in public and all these types of different things, that's the inclination that I have. Could I be wrong? Definitely, probably, maybe, but alas, that is our rhetoric section for today. So essentially, to sum up, David Dobrik has been fiddling with what's called like political rhetoric and consequences, and trying to manage them in a public way so that they are minimal, infrequent, short-lived, and fizzle out. But then once they've affected the scope of other people, such as Jeff's family, friends, people were crying at the hospital, and it has traumatized other people who witnessed that accident, then they have to kind of become a public address. And David Dobrik, because he has forced everything into the private cycle for all of his career, if/when anything ended up coming up, this is a new direction for him, and it doesn't seem to really be able to take a much of a human approach as I would have liked, or anyone would have really liked, I think, based on kind of the comments and what I've been seeing. To conclude, David Dobrik is not really any different than, you know, any other scummy influencer. He was just kind of better at managing a publicly perceived probable truth. I talked about the probable truth of like the rhetoric aspect of everything. And he just managed that probable truth in a more calculated and intelligent way than a lot of his contemporaries, such as, let's say, people like Tana Mojo or Jeffree Star or stuff like that, right? So he was seen as unproblematic, while his actions were pretty objectively problematic if you laid them out and reviewed them. That's all for the video. Thanks again to Ren for sponsoring the video. I hope you guys enjoy doing your little carbon emissions test and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, that's it for today. Swish Gang says goodbye. I'm going to go look at mineral projects and read my books. You guys have a great day. This should probably be the only video for this week because a girl needs to graduate university. I'm crying, I'm screaming, and yeah, you guys have a great day wherever you are. Bye.
Hey, aren't you that radical leftist guy?
Oh no, dude, I'm a radical leftist.
Yes, I think we should start taxing the rich more.